So welcome to PMP certification training by Procurement. Today we will be looking at project procurement management. This lecture covers chapter 12 of the PMBok 5th edition, and we will consider this to be the last lecture of the PMP series. Taken from page 61 in the PMBok, we see here that there are 4 processes in project procurement management: plan procurement management, conduct procurement, control, and close procurement, each covering one area of the process group with the exception of the initiating process group. So in this chapter we would be viewing the procurement from a buyer's perspective. PMI views that the project manager in question is acting primarily on behalf of the buyer as opposed to the seller. You can have a project manager also acting on behalf of the seller, but the chapter predominantly focuses on the project manager acting on behalf of the buyer. When we talk about procurement, we are speaking about goods, services, or product services and results that are required from outside of the performance organization, outside of the project team. That is, these product, services, or results, for some reason, are unable to be manufactured from within the project team or the performance organization. So we talk about to procure, it means I'm going outside of the performance organization. As shared before, the chapter covers the procurement perspective from the standpoint of the buyer. The element of procurement management entails contract. Contracts form core element of procurement. So for there to be a contract, there must be an offer, something of acceptance. So we are actually going to procure an excavator. There's something of consideration that is of value to the excavator, something of value. The persons or parties involved must be of legal capacity, so you can't see you getting into contract with a minor. And for legal purpose, so we can't say we are purchasing the excavator to go and assist in constructing a cocaine or marijuana compression plant. All right, so you ensure that there's an offer acceptance, there's something for consideration, the parties involved have legal capacity, and there must be for a legal purpose. This slide, one can say, summarizes the procurement process end to end. Let's use an example of purchasing a number of tanks, let's say 1,000-gallon tanks, to create a tank farm for a customer. Now let's say we are about to purchase 50 of such tanks to create this tank farm. The process starts, and this process is not necessarily a PMI's process, but you can go through this and identify various touch points, and you can see where the PMI process falls into line. So first we identify needs and start planning. So the needs are clear. We need 1,000 gallons of tanks strategically set up, installed using international best practices for a particular client. Then we write the specs, terms of reference, and scope of works. So terms of reference and scope of work is where we indicate background, what would be purchased, how many, what are the requirements or specifications, are there any safety matters to be considered or quality standards to be adhered to, and so forth. That's the terms of reference or scope of works. Then there's choose a procurement method. So the method might be, are we going to use a fixed price? Are we going to use cost reimbursables? What's our procurement strategy? Are we going to submit an expression of interest, i.e. an EOI, followed by an RFP, or an RFI first, that is a request for information followed by an RFP or RFQ. Would we use an RFQ or an RFP? Which do we use? So these questions would be posed, and there would be a strategy selected. Then there's the preparation of the solicitation documents. And these documents refer to either the RFP, RFQ, or tender. Right? So those are the tender documents, invitation to bid. So the RFP or RFQ will encapsulate or would wrap the TOR. The RFP or RFQ would have in it as part of it as an annex or appendix or somewhere in the code terms of reference. And this RFP or RFQ will give the instructions. So whereas the terms of reference speak to the procurement itself and the items to be procured, the RFP give instructions to the potential bidders as to what date must your submission be made, what time, where must it be made, how many copies, what are the legal documents that you must submit for consideration, such as a valid VAT certificate or NIS, showing your payments or your tax. And those are important documents that must be submitted. You may ask for other documents, right, such as references for manufacturers, etc. This is after the preparation, the document, the RFP, RFQ is submitted, and sometime there will be a lag time, and during that time frame, vendors can seek clarification. So if it's a tank farm, the vendors may make a site visit, and they may ask questions, clarification questions, and the project manager must ensure that all vendors have copy of the minutes, so that everyone is have access to the same bit of information, and there is no advantage one has over the other. This is then followed by after there's a receiving of the proposal documents at the stipulated time, date and time, an evaluation is then conducted. So an evaluation committee would convene. In this case, for the tank farm, it may comprise of the facilities manager, who might lead the entire evaluation team, someone from finance or accounts, someone from procurement or legal, and a subject matter expert, might be an engineer or a senior technician who is familiar with waterworks and tanks and stuff like that. So the evaluation is conducted using our evaluation criteria. After that, a report is issued. It depends on if you're going to have evaluation, technical as well as financial evaluations. You may have 2 reports submitted. These reports are then submitted to seniors. They are then approved or may not be. If they are, you could enter into negotiations depending on the type of procurement process. You can negotiate on price, you can negotiate on services, you can negotiate on different items, and once there's an agreement, you can then provide a letter of offer, or some persons prefer to provide a letter of favorable consideration. Right? And thereafter, you would then go into contract signing. Contract administration follows, whereas implementation, so you may possibly make a down payment, you may have probably a performance bond to be submitted, to be issued, and then the goods, in this case the tank farm, is implemented thereafter. Right, so the role of the project manager for procurement primarily is twofold. One is risk identification and evaluation, and the other is working with the procurement process. There are some projects in which the project manager actually performs the role of the procurement officer. That may happen for smaller projects. For larger projects, there will be an explicit hat person, warm body, as in a procurement professional. But this can happen. But so speaking in a larger project, the PM's role, help the risk, identify risk, and evaluate such, and work within the procurement process. So you don't want to flout the procurement procedures. Right? So if it says you have to get 3 quotations, do an evaluation based upon price, lowest price, and make sure quality is up to par, then that's what you actually will have to do. So the 4 processes are plan, procurement management. So here where we identify, we document and decide upon, specify the approach or the strategy. Right? What is the procurement strategy will we be using? What is the contract approach that we'll be using? Then there's conduct. So conduct occurs under implement. So after you would devise and identify using RFP, and we are using cost reimbursables, then we proceed to do the necessary stuff. We submit the RFP, collect the documents, do the evaluation, award the contract. Control procurement. So this is where we would do the implementation. Now, once the implementation, we already are in implementation mode, but at this point you're under control. You want to ensure that the contract is honored. It is the project manager's duty to ensure the contract is honored both by the vendor or buyer and the seller. So if the seller has to submit the 50 tanks, were those tanks submitted according to specs? If the buyer had to ensure and to pay within 30 days of submission of invoice, did the buyer do that? So that's the rule under control. Then we have closed procurements, completing each project procurement. Now, closed procurement does not mean closing the project. Closed procurement means for that instance where a seller is engaged, that engagement has now terminated, or it has come to an end. That's all it means. Doesn't mean you have come to the end of the project. So plan procurement management is here we document the procurement decisions, the approach. We decide, are we going to make, are we going to buy? We do market research, and at the end there's a procurement management plan / strategy for what is to be done. So that's the point here. The benefit of this is we determine whether to acquire outside support, if to acquire, how to acquire it, how much is needed. Do we go 50-50? Do we use some of our internal forces, and some of the more difficult stuff we outsource that? So you come up with your strategy, right? What must have a strategy. So the intent of the planned procurement management, it identifies the project needs that can best be met, right, or should be met by acquiring products, services, or results outside of the performing organization. So if it is that those needs can be met from within, then it is not a good investment, right? So for example, if you have to buy laptops and the company is into waterworks, they don't make laptops, so it's better you buy it, right? You'll buy paper and a number of things you'll purchase, but there are some things that you would not purchase, right? Because you may be able to do that internally. So that's the intent of the procurement, of planned procurement management. The type of contract selected is dependent on a few factors. The scope, is the scope well defined? So for the tanks, do I know exactly the size, the thickness, the gauge, the quality of the type of material or plastic being used, compression techniques? Am I aware of the frequency exchange expected? Am I aware of the industry standard? So depending your contract type selection or your procurement strategy would be impacted by answering these questions or addressing these factors. And these factors would play a very important role in selecting your procurement strategy. PMI has identified 3 categories of contracts: fixed price, cost reimbursable, and time and material. So we'll look at each in turn. For cost reimbursables, I always like to use a simple analogy to explain cost reimbursables. You take your car to the mechanic, say your car is not working properly, so the mechanic say, oh, listen, what I'll do a run through, I'll do a diagnostic, and whatever part to be changed, I'll buy the part, I'll be marked the receipt, and then you reimburse me for the part, and then I'll charge you what is my fee, right? So, and the fee might be, let's say we agree to a $500 fee, and that's it. So that's cost reimbursable in a nutshell, right? Where the seller would put out the buyer would reimburse and then pay a separate fee. Now there are different types. So there's cost plus fixed fee. Buyers pay all the cost, and so the fee is what, if you want to use the word quote unquote labor, is being charged by the seller. Cost plus incentive. The incentive fee is where we agree on there's a fee. So let's say it's $500 my fee, and I will reimburse, you will reimburse me whatever cost I put out. However, we want to incentivize, right? It's a form of trying to incentivize the seller. So there may be some conditionalities that if the estimated cost that was told, let's say that the actual cost is less than the estimated cost and there's a savings, then the seller can benefit in part from that savings. However, if it is that the cost exceeds, the actual cost exceeds the estimated cost, then the seller in this particular model is CPIF. The seller would have to dip in his pocket to actually offset. So if we say we estimate it's $10,000, this is $1 million for the 50 tanks that we are buying, $1 million for it, and the cost itself, the cost estimate was more. Then we are saying there is a point where the seller will have to actually do the dip in their pocket, right? Cost plus award fee is also incentivization, but there's no potential penalty. The cost plus incentive fee has a built-in penalty depending if the actual cost goes over the planned. But for award fee, there's no penalty. Right? Time and material is taken into consideration where the job is for a short period and is labor intensive, such as minor plumbing job, minor masonry, minor electrical, along those lines. All right, so it might be roughly about a week of effort, and so time and material sits somewhere between fixed price and cost reimbursables as a strategy. So fixed price differs from cost reimbursable in terms of where fixed price is concerned. The buyer pays what has to be paid, but the risk, there's a lot of risk on the seller side. So for example, we're buying these tanks, right? We're buying 50 1,000 gallon tanks, and for whatever reason the tank stays on the port because it was being imported for longer than 15 days. There's increased port charge that has nothing to do with to a large degree to do with the buyer. So if the seller end up paying extra on the port, or while the truck was transporting the tank, I mean, unfortunately the truck got into an accident and 5 of the tanks got damaged, that has nothing to do and doesn't change the cost for where the buyer is concerned because it's fixed. So in that scenario, even if it means that the seller has to pay more, the risk is passed on to the seller. So you have firm fixed price, you can have it to an incentive. The firm fixed price economic price adjustment is long term. For persons who are familiar with SEA, let's assume that after SEA the government purchased 17,000 laptops for all SEA students who would have passed, and the government entered into a long-term contract with Dell and say over the next 5 years we'll be buying machines from you to satisfy our secondary students who would have just passed the SEA. Now let's say assume the government settle on a price $900 for a laptop, but there can be international economic indicators where there's no control, such as international inflation and different factors, and so we agree those $900 TT per laptop, we agree every year we will increase it by 5%. All right, so the price is fixed. There's adjustment made because this is a long-term arrangement to cater for factors beyond the control of both parties. This is a diagram is worth meditating upon to help assimilate the difference among cost reimbursable, fixed price, time, and material. You'll observe that from the bottom going up that the risk. So for the seller, the seller has less risk with cost plus. Why? Well, whatever cost the seller pays, the buyer will reimburse. So most of the risk is on the buyer side. Now you choose cost plus also when you have functional requirements and not detailed technical requirements. If I am buying some laptops and I have all the technical specs, I'll use full fixed price because I know what I want. It's very clear. So if you look at the first criterion, scope of work information, if that is very little, that is, you're not too sure, you're sure on functional specs. I mean, I want some water tanks to ensure that we have this hotel system and we have a school and water doesn't run out, and you begin to just describe it at a high level, functional level, then you may use the cost plus reimbursable. If you know what you want and you have the details down, then you use firm fixed price. But good diagram to study, to review, and looking at the risk factor spread and how it differentiates between buyer and seller, and also when dealing with uncertainty and scope of work also. Make or buy analysis is an important decision, has to be taken when doing planned procurement. So when do you buy? Well, you buy to decrease risk. So we will buy laptops, we buy tissue paper, we buy paper to print on, we buy books. We don't make those things because the time it will take us, the cost incurred, and it doesn't make sense, right? We stick to our core business. We buy. When do we make? Well, we make if one, we have idle plant and workforce. So if you have people on the ground and that's what we hire them for, and they're not really putting much, producing that much, and we can, and this is their core area, well, yeah. You want to retain control, and sometimes outsourcing, which we call a form of procurement, where you engage in a third party, you may not have the full control of the quality and a number of different factors, right? Proprietary information and procedures. So I always tell people that Kentucky Fried Chicken, also called KFC, will outsource everything except in frying chicken. That is their core. You don't outsource what is your core. So proprietary information, you don't want to let vendors know, you know, what your trade secrets are and stuff like that. So you wouldn't look to outsource that. Buy versus lease question. So sometimes there's a little trade-off. Do I buy, do I lease? Well, it depends, and that sometimes causes influence such decisions, and we'll look at an example in our next slide for a buy and lease question. So question here, you are trying to decide if you should rent or buy a piece of equipment. Let's say it's a generator. The cost to rent per day is $300. The cost to purchase the piece of equipment is $14,000 plus $50 per day to operate. All right, so we know the cost to rent, that is one. We know the cost to purchase, right? After how many days does the cost to rent equal the cost to buy? Right, so there's a point in time you start off, you observe from looking at it alone, you can tell 14,000 plus 50 is a lot you have to put out. But there'll come a point somewhere down the road where the cost to buy and cost to rent will equal. So how do we go about doing this? Well, first we look at, let D equal the number of days, either whereby it is the days such that the cost to rent is equal to the cost to buy. Let it be that day in the future, right? Then if that is so, then we want to solve for D such that the cost to rent, which is $300 per day, $300 multiplied by D, must be equal to the cost to buy. And the cost to buy is $14,000 plus $50 per day. And we solve for D, and we find out that bam, D equal 56. All right, so you can go over the example for a while and study it. These are probably how some of the calculation questions may appear. So some of the outputs that you can have is an RFP, RFQ, invitation for bid. So RFP stems primarily from cost reimbursables because they deal with functional specs or a solution. So if you want to have a software solution, a training solution, or some kind of solution, it means highly likely that a request for proposal you will submit. If you know these 50 tanks, for example, you clear exactly what you need, then it might just be an RFQ, All right, so it depends on the nature of the procurement. All right, so some of the criteria for that you will use in the next process will be developed here, and it's important. Right, so for example, one thing is it's important to know what the criteria are so that you ensure that there's equity, fairness in doing your evaluation. So you want to know, did the bidder understand the existing need? Was it clear in their solution or in their proposal or quotation? What about the life cycle cost? Because yes, I could install 50 tanks, it costs $1 million. What about the cost to maintain it? But did you ask for that? So I mean, you cannot evaluate what you didn't ask for. But if suppose you did ask for life cycle costs, what would be the maintenance estimated thereafter? Because the project can be cheap, but the maintenance can be heavy, and depending on the type of tanks or system chosen, and you wouldn't want that. They want them to convince you of the technical ability, who is certified and stuff like that. What risk measure they're going to put in place for these tanks. The management approach. All right, so you'd want to know governance structure, reporting mechanism, the technical approach, what they're going to cast first, how they're going to move the tanks in place, what is the warranty they are providing, the financial capacity. Let's say they are providing some sort of post-implementation services, so you don't want to make sure they don't go belly up during that time. So are they strong financially? What about their capacity and interest and their project management ability? So all these things you want to take into consideration when, well, most instances when you are going to do a vendor selection. Just some terminologies: force majeure, it has to do with natural disasters, indemnification to terms of who is liable, single source, sole source, and you have selected also. So in one case, the contract directly with preferred seller, and sole, only one supplier available in the market. So let's say for the tanks, you have several people selling tanks, but you may choose a single source, right? The contract directly with a preferred seller. Hey, you go to this person. Sole mean only one person could supply. There's a particular type of tank technology. There's only one manufacturing trying to be able that can provide that. Well, you go sole source. So what's the first process? If you said plant procurement management, you were right. So conduct procurement means we already have the RFP and stuff. We submit it. We conduct bidders conference. Then we do our evaluation. We do different things in doing the evaluation. At the end, we have our selected vendors. There's an agreement or contract signed up, and there can be other things actually occurring. But under conduct procurement, here we would have gone through the procurement process to the point of selecting the vendor. So bidders conference, we discussed this before when we showed the entire workflow. The proposal, evaluation techniques, as you can use different evaluation techniques depending on how you want to score, how you're choosing your criteria. If it says 70% technical, 30% must be cost. Are you going to do technical first and financials after? So you have some options that you can use, right, in terms of for doing your evaluation. So when you select a seller may be simply selected, ask to sign a standard contract, or you may go into negotiations. You may also do a short list and ask each seller to do a presentation before you go into negotiations, with even more than one seller, depending on where persons may have reached and the score they may have attained. So an agreement can be an actual contract document, can be a PO, you could have a MOU. You have different ways in which you can have these agreements. When we say agreement, we talk about a contract document, which is very formal. So the second process is conduct procurements. So control procurement follows. So having conduct the procurement, control here where we're going to manage relationship. We're going to monitor the contract performance. We want to make sure that the contract is being honored. The key thing here is to ensure the contract is honored both by the seller and the buyer. You want to maintain good, harmonious relationship between both parties, and so, right, you want to ensure both seller and buyer performance meets the procurement requirements. So different tools and techniques here you would use performance. I think for me the most important one is the procurement performance reviews, where you're reviewing, you're conducting inspections and audit also separately to ensure that, hey, are we doing this in a way in which we are honoring the contract, right? Is the seller providing goods and services in keeping with the contract? Is the buyer supporting that and not frustrating the seller, and is also paying the seller what it's supposed to, right? And processing the invoice within the stipulated time frame, and is the seller given the quality that they're supposed to give? And all these things you look at here under the control procurement. Thus, one of the outputs here being, let's say, change requests could actually occur, if the seller, so you had a number of cases, the buyer wasn't happy. I know recently listened to a training program and the buyer wasn't happy, and the buyer told the seller, hey, you had to do all this training because people wasn't happy here at all, yeah? So I had to do it all over. So all those things you look at, are we in keeping with what was agreed upon? Claims administration. A claim is an assertion that the buyer did something to hurt the seller, and the seller asking for compensation. So what if the seller for these tanks hired some transport company, and these 5 trucks are now moving in with 25 tanks, and when they reach the compound for the seller, for the buyer, the compound is closed. Security guard said we have no authorization to let anybody else in, and the seller say, hey, I pay these truckers $10,000 to transport these things. If you go back to storage, who's going to pay for storage, and who's going to pay these truckers? Security guard say, well, I don't know. All I know, they can't enter the compound. And that could be a claim, yeah, because it could incur costs. The seller could say, you all set me up these additional costs, I didn't cater for this, who's going to pay for this? And those are where you could have claims occurring, right? And what you want to ensure, though, is as much as possible, I mean, you may use arbitration, different system, but you want to avoid going to the court. That hurts relationship, any kind of relationship that's normally hurt, right? Whether it be divorce or be it a lawsuit, it just causes pain. So you want to avoid that. And so instead you go into arbitration to see how that could be mended and addressed. When we go into the closed procurement, we're talking about the process consists of finishing all the loose ends of the contract. We do lessons learned. We ensure we process all payments, that there's no payment owing to any vendor. We also do an evaluation of that vendor. If the vendor did excellent work, I mean, good for him, for her. It may cause for future possible work. If not, person could be blacklisted, placed on a blacklist, and say, hey, carefully, consider if you want to use this vendor again in the future. We're not sure. We had put a ban for 2 years. Let him come again probably after 2 years and see if he can sort out himself. All right, so closed procurement will entail some of these activities. So we spoke about control procurement, and just to ensure that contract is honored by both seller and buyer. So the final process is closed procurement. This is our last slide, and it's a process of completing each procurement. Observe there each procurement. So if you have 10 procurements, so in this particular project for the 50 tanks, one project was for casting plinth and casting some platforms for the tank. That was a separate project by itself, and another was to procure the tanks and to set it up and stuff like that. Let's say that, and a separate project could have been, or procurement could have been, having some monitoring system for the water and ensuring that there is proper usage and security of it and stuff along those lines. So you can have several procurements. Closed procurements speak to completing each procurement. Right? And at the end, we would lessons learned, update your OPAs, and go forward for another procurement.